Okay, now we will go on to our last strategy, which is Rate Plus. For this strategy, I will go through the entire section in the lecture notes with you because this strategy is not as straightforward as the previous three. Okay, so this video will be longer, but I think it's important because if you read this section on your own, you may not be able to fully understand what Rate Plus does and some of its limitations. Okay, let's first start by looking at what is happening in tropical forests today. So we know that tropical forests are mainly found in less developed or developing countries. Usually in short form, we call them LDCs. So there are three main regions of tropical forests in the world today. The first one is found in the Amazon in South America. The second region is the Congo Basin in Africa, and the third region is Southeast Asia. So, in these regions, most of the countries are developing or less developed countries. So, tropical forests, therefore, are mainly found in less developed countries. And these countries can either choose to protect the forest or exploit the forest. So the first option is to choose to protect the forest. Now, if they choose to protect the forest, it will be great for the environment. You protect the biodiversity. And we also know that forests are carbon sinks. So forests can absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and help to reduce global warming. So this is a great scenario for the environment. Okay, but there's also a second option, which is that these countries can exploit the forest for economic development. So, for example, in our neighboring Indonesia and Malaysia, oftentimes the decision made is to clear forest land to grow palm oil. This is also understandable because many of these countries are less developed, so they do need to boost the economy and reduce poverty. And one way to do so is to conduct deforestation and then use the forest land for other purposes, such as agriculture or cattle ranching or logging and so on. So this means, of course, that whether or not to protect the forest, there is an economic aspect involved, right? Because if these developing countries choose to protect the forest, it means that they forego the potential of forested land for economic development. So, what Red Plus is trying to do is to incorporate this economic aspect into the management of forests in developing countries and provide them financial incentives to conserve forests. So, RED Plus or RED is an effort to create a financial value for the carbon stored in forests. RED is part of the climate change mitigation measures. So therefore, they are interested in the ability and the value of forests in storing carbon dioxide and reducing global warming. So we know that forests are very valuable in this regard, but what RED does is to provide a financial value to the carbon that is stored in forests. And in so doing, they want to provide financial incentives for developing countries to reduce emissions by reducing deforestation and degradation. Okay, and therefore, RED stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So, meaning that they want to encourage developing countries to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions by reducing deforestation and forest degradation. So, let's look at how it works in more detail. So, as mentioned, a RED Plus is under the United Nations climate change framework, right? So, what it does is to actually enable compensation to be paid to those who forego the right to cut them down. So, essentially, RED Plus would pay the less developed countries to conserve and protect their forests. So remember that when countries choose to protect the forest, there will be an economic loss, right? Because they cannot use the forested land for economic development. So RED Plus tries to offset the economic loss by paying compensation to these less developed countries, which forego the right to cut down their forests. Okay, then there's this plus, right? It's not just RED, but RED Plus. The plus just means that we have to go beyond, right? It's a plus, we go beyond just reducing deforestation and forest degradation. And the aim of RED Plus is to also include the conservation and sustainable management of forests. So it's not just about not cutting trees down, but rather conserving and managing forests in a sustainable manner. How is this done? So who would pay the developing countries? Essentially, RED Plus will involve developed countries paying less developed or developing countries to conserve forests and therefore limit the carbon emissions. This is part of carbon trading. We will learn more about carbon trading when we go to Theme 3, when we look at climate change. But now I just want to briefly explain to you why would developed countries want to pay less developed countries to conserve their forests. Okay, so to understand this, we need to know what are the requirements of international climate agreements. Okay, so we know in our world today that some countries are more developed than others, right? So developed countries could be countries like Germany, the UK, Norway, and so on. Then less developed countries could be countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, and so on. Okay, so under international climate change agreements, this agreement only require developed countries to cut their carbon emissions in absolute terms so as to reduce global warming. However, the same international climate agreements do not require LDCs to cut carbon emissions, as it's understood that LDCs are still growing their economies, so they are given some slack in this regard. So, for instance, if LDCs were to build more factories to create jobs, they are sort of allowed to do that because they need to promote economic growth and reduce poverty. Okay, so this is what's happening in the world today. So it means that only the developed countries are required to cut their carbon dioxide emissions in absolute terms. So this creates the incentive for developed countries to pay LDCs to conserve the forest in LDCs, because when the forest is conserved, right, it helps to save carbon dioxide emissions. And the carbon dioxide emissions that is saved will then count back towards the developed countries' target. Okay, so when a DC pay an LDC to conserve their forest, right, this process helps to save carbon dioxide emissions because we know that forest helps to absorb carbon dioxide, right? And if you choose not to cut down the forest, it means that you don't release the carbon that is stored in the forest into the atmosphere. So, for example, in this case, let's say that by conserving this forest, I help to save 5 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. So, these 5 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions that are safe will then count back towards the developed country target. So if this country has a target to cut 20 million tons of carbon dioxide, through the REDD Plus scheme, it can then remove 5 million tons from its carbon dioxide emissions. It means that it only has 15 million more tons to go in terms of reaching its climate change target. Okay, so this is why REDD Plus encourages developed countries to pay less developed countries to conserve their forests and to create this win-win situation for both countries. Right, so indeed, the proponents of REDD Plus describe it as a win-win framework. On one hand, developing countries or your less developed countries, they win because they reduce deforestation, but at the same time, they are rewarded financially and they are given money and investments to reward them for not cutting the forest down and for protecting and conserving their forests. So they benefit not just in terms of the environmental benefit of protecting forests, but also economically from the REDD Plus financial compensation. Okay, on the other hand, your developed countries or industrialized countries, they also benefit because they get to offset their emissions, right? It counts towards their emissions target. Okay, so it says here they get to offset their own emissions without necessarily reducing them because they are not reducing emissions back in their own country, right? But they get to offset based on their work and investment in another less developed country. Okay, and this is also a win for biodiversity within the forest because now the forest is protected, as well as the livelihoods of indigenous forest dwellers. So a REDD Plus project is meant to also help to protect the livelihoods of people living in the forest by not allowing or not or discouraging the local government from cutting the forest down. Okay, so in box 1 on page 16, you see an example of a positive REDD Plus project that is done in Cambodia. Right, so in this case, this project aims to, of course, prevent deforestation, right, and also to conserve the biodiversity. So the area that is chosen is an area with rich biological diversity and a wealth of forest resources. Interestingly, it's also the ancestral homeland of a large number of ethnic Bunong people. Right, so the REDD Plus project is not just about conserving the forest, conserving the biodiversity, but also helping the local people who are living in the forest. So the project is helping them to secure their forest tenure rights and also generate long-term incomes. So you can see that this is part of the win-win situation we're talking about, where it's not just the government that will benefit in terms of getting compensation financially for conserving the forest, but the local people and their livelihoods can also be protected because the forest is protected and the forest is their home, right? The forest is where they get their resources from. There's a term here that says forest tenure rights. Some of you may not know what it means. So what it means is just the right to own the forest, to use, to manage and make decisions about forest resources. So even though indigenous people live in forests, not many of them have the rights to own the forest or the rights to make decisions about forest resources. And therefore, it's important to help these communities secure their forest tenure rights so that they can choose how they want to use the forest resources themselves. One example where the local community do not have forest tenure rights is the case of the Mulu forest, which we looked at in our tutorial on palm oil, right? Remember, in the forest, a lot of their land is being cleared without their permission and against their will for logging and palm oil operations. Okay, so it's important to also help the local people secure their forest tenure rights so that the local communities can continue to live in the forest. And usually, these local communities do not cause as much damage to the forest because they need to live in the forest for the long run. So they tend to be able to manage the forest in a more sustainable manner compared to large companies like logging companies or palm oil companies where they just want to clear the whole land and um, grow as much plants as much oil palms as possible and so on. Okay, so this is REDD Plus, right, in terms of how it works and some of the positive aspect of REDD Plus. Okay, in the next video, we'll look at the limitations and challenges of REDD Plus.